New York City, September 19, 1960, 11:42 a.m. Malcolm X stood in the lobby of the Hotel Teresa on 125th Street in Harlem, straightening his tie, preparing to knock on the door of the most controversial man in the Western Hemisphere. Fidel Castro, Prime Minister of Cuba, revolutionary leader, the man the United States government had been trying to destroy for nearly 2 years, was upstairs, in Harlem. In a black-owned hotel, surrounded by Cuban Revolutionary Guards and Harlem neighbors who'd come to gawk at the spectacle. The FBI had agents on every corner. The CIA had a surveillance team across the street. The State Department was furious. The press was hysterical. And Malcolm X, national spokesman for the Nation of Islam, 35 years old and already considered the most dangerous black man in America, had walked in through the front door. And asked to see him, nobody stopped him. Nobody could, because what was happening at the Hotel Teresa wasn't just a meeting between two men. It was a collision between two ideas, two different visions of what resistance looked like, two people the American government feared in different ways for different reasons. And when they finally shook hands, something happened that the United States couldn't control, couldn't spin, and couldn't make disappear. History was made on 125th Street, not in the Senate, not in the White House, in Harlem, and America went absolutely insane. To understand why that meeting was explosive, you have to understand what Fidel Castro was doing in New York in September 1960. The United Nations General Assembly was convening its annual session. World leaders from across the globe had descended on Manhattan. Castro, who had led the Cuban Revolution in January 1959 and was consolidating power in Havana, was there to address the General Assembly and to meet with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The Cold War was at boiling point. Cuba had nationalized American businesses. The U.S. was preparing what would become the Bay of Pigs invasion. And Castro, defiant, brilliant, calculated, was using the UN stage to position Cuba as a leader of the non-aligned world. He arrived in New York on September 18, and immediately everything went wrong. His delegation had booked rooms at the Shelbourne Hotel on Lexington Avenue. Within hours, hotel management demanded a $10, $0 cash deposit, claiming fear of property damage. Castro's team called it what it was: discrimination, political harassment, a message from the American establishment: you are not welcome here. Castro's response was characteristically dramatic. He announced he was going to camp in Central Park if necessary. He said his delegation would sleep in the United Nations building itself rather than bow to American pressure. The media loved it, the State Department panicked. And then, through a connection nobody has ever fully explained, someone suggested the Hotel Teresa. The Hotel Teresa was not just any hotel, it was the Waldorf Astoria of Harlem. Built in 1913 at the corner of 7th Avenue and 125th Street, it rose 14 stories above the heart of Black America's cultural capital. For its first 27 years, it was restricted to white guests only, another monument to the casual cruelty of American segregation. After integration in 1940, it became something extraordinary, the premier destination for Black entertainers. Businesspeople, athletes, and dignitaries who were turned away from downtown hotels because of their race. Joe Louis had stayed there before championship fights, his presence drawing crowds that filled the sidewalk. Josephine Baker swept through its lobby trailing glamour and defiance. Lena Horne, Duke Ellington, Sugar Ray Robinson, Paul Robeson. The list was a history of Black excellence in an era when Black excellence was systematically denied space in the rest of the city. The hotel had hosted political meetings, cultural celebrations, community organizing sessions. It was woven into the fabric of Harlem's identity in a way that no midtown hotel could be. When Fidel Castro moved his delegation to the Hotel Teresa on September 19, 1960, he wasn't just finding alternative accommodation. He was inserting himself into a living symbol of Black dignity and resistance. Whether he understood the full weight of that symbolism is debated. His later statements suggest he did. Either way, the effect was the same. He turned his eviction from a midtown hotel into a global statement about racial solidarity and anti-imperialism. And it drew Malcolm X like a magnet. Malcolm X heard about Castro's move to Hotel Teresa within hours. He was at the Nation of Islam's Temple No. 7 in Harlem when the news reached him. His reaction was immediate and visceral. A man they tried to humiliate chose to come to us. That sentence captures everything. To Malcolm, Castro's move to Harlem wasn't just a political gesture. It was a validation. It said that Harlem wasn't a consolation prize, that Black America wasn't a fallback option, that the most powerful revolutionary in the Americas had looked at the world and decided he'd rather be in the Black community than in the white-approved spaces of Midtown Manhattan. Malcolm recognized in Castro something he recognized in himself: the refusal to perform gratitude for acceptance, the willingness to be unwelcome in certain rooms and proud of it, the understanding that power doesn't always live in the places power says it lives. Malcolm didn't call ahead, didn't schedule an appointment, didn't ask permission. He put on his suit, walked the blocks to Hotel Teresa, and presented himself at the front desk. "I'm here to see Prime Minister Castro." The desk clerk looked at him. "Do you have an appointment?" Malcolm looked back. "Tell him Malcolm X is here." 20 minutes later, he was ushered upstairs. The meeting between Malcolm X and Fidel Castro lasted approximately 20 to 30 minutes. What was said remains partially obscure. No official transcript exists. No recording was made public. Castro's own accounts over the years have been general and philosophical. Malcolm X spoke about the meeting in several interviews, but always in broad strokes. What we know from multiple witnesses and the accounts of those present is this: the two men shook hands warmly. They sat together. They spoke through an interpreter, though Malcolm later said Castro's English was better than he let on publicly. They discussed colonialism. They discussed racism in America. They discussed the relationship between economic exploitation and racial oppression. Castro spoke about Cuba's experience under American economic domination. Malcolm spoke about Black Americans' experience under segregation and systemic racism. The parallel that both men clearly saw was this: colonial powers used the same tactics on oppressed nations as racist systems use on oppressed people: divide, dehumanize, exploit, control. Malcolm and Castro were fighting the same system from different corners of the world. The meeting had the quality of recognition, two people discovering they'd been reading the same book from different chapters. Photographers were allowed in for the first minutes of the meeting. The images captured Castro in his military fatigues, Malcolm in his dark suit, both leaning forward in conversation, went around the world within hours. American newspapers covered it with barely concealed horror. The New York Times used the word controversial 6 times in its article about the meeting. The FBI's New York field office filed an urgent report. Malcolm X met with Castro today. Nature of discussion unknown, significance high. The State Department issued a statement saying nothing official should be read into the meeting, but the intensity of their discomfort said everything, because what had happened at Hotel Teresa wasn't just two men talking. It was a visual statement that terrified the American establishment. The most prominent Black radical in America had walked into a room with the most prominent communist revolutionary in the Americas and treated him as an equal, as a brother, as someone fighting the same enemy from different ground. And that connection between Black American liberation and anti-colonial revolution worldwide was exactly the kind of thinking the American government most feared. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, received a briefing on the meeting the same day. His response was characteristically obsessive. He ordered an immediate expansion of Malcolm's surveillance, more wiretaps, more informants embedded in the Nation of Islam, more documentation of every contact, every call, every association. Hoover had been monitoring Malcolm since 1953, tracking his rise within the nation, cataloging his speeches, building a file that would eventually run to thousands of pages. But the Castro meeting elevated Malcolm's threat level in Hoover's estimation to something new. Because Malcolm wasn't just talking about Black rights anymore. He was making connections, drawing lines between Harlem and Havana, between Birmingham and Bogota, between the lynching tree and the colonial plantation. He was building an international framework for Black liberation that didn't need American approval, didn't ask for American sympathy, and wasn't limited by American borders. That framework was dangerous, not because it advocated violence, but because it offered Black Americans a context larger than America in which to understand their struggle. And a context larger than America was a context the American government couldn't control. Hoover wrote in his personal notes that week, "The Malcolm X Castro meeting represents a new and potentially more dangerous phase of Black nationalist activity. The internationalization of this movement must be prevented." He spent the next 5 years trying to prevent it. He never fully succeeded. The Harlem community's reaction to Castro's visit and to Malcolm's meeting with him was complex and revealing. Many Harlem residents were delighted. Here was a world leader who'd chosen to come to them, who'd been rejected by white Manhattan and found welcome in black Harlem. Street vendors appeared outside Hotel Teresa selling Castro buttons alongside copies of Mohammed Speaks. Barbershops buzzed with conversation. The meeting between Malcolm and Castro became a point of community pride. Some older residents were skeptical. The Cold War was real. Communism was a loaded word. The Nation of Islam officially opposed communism. Malcolm was treading in complicated ideological territory by meeting Castro. Some civil rights leaders distanced themselves, worried that association with Castro would give segregationist ammunition to call the movement communist infiltrated. MLK advisors privately expressed concern. The NAACP issued no comment, but on the street, in the barbershops and churches and pool halls of Harlem, the reaction was simpler. Malcolm went to see Castro. Castro came to Harlem, and America lost its mind, which meant both of them were doing something right. Castro's stay at Hotel Teresa lasted 5 days, until September 23, when the UN General Assembly session concluded. During those 5 days, the hotel became the unlikely center of world politics. Khrushchev visited Castro there, making the journey uptown from his own United Nations commitments in what was itself a theatrical gesture. Gamal Abdel Nasser, president of Egypt, sent a representative. Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru visited. The leaders of Ghana, Guinea, and Indonesia made contact. Hotel Teresa, this Harlem landmark that had once been restricted to white guests, was suddenly hosting the leaders of the non-aligned world. It was extraordinary, and Malcolm X, who had visited on the first day, watched the subsequent events with satisfaction. He'd been right. Harlem wasn't a consolation prize. It was a capital, a gathering place for the world's people who'd been told they didn't belong in the rooms where decisions were made, and they were making decisions anyway. The significance of the Castro-Malcolm meeting extended far beyond its 30 minutes. It was one of the first moments when Malcolm publicly articulated what would become the central thesis of his final years, that the black freedom struggle in America was part of a global struggle against colonialism, racism, and economic exploitation. That black Americans weren't an isolated minority fighting for acceptance within American society, but part of a worldwide majority fighting for human dignity against systems built to deny it. Malcolm would develop this idea extensively over the next 4 years. His trip to Africa in 1964, his efforts to bring the question of black American rights before the United Nations as a human rights issue rather than a domestic civil rights issue, his connections with revolutionary leaders in Ghana, Tanzania, Egypt, and elsewhere. All of it traced back to a vision he was already articulating in 1960, a vision that got a little sharper in a hotel room in Harlem with Fidel Castro across the table. The American government never stopped being afraid of this vision, because it was genuinely threatening to the established order. Not through violence, but through consciousness. If black Americans understood their struggle as part of a global anti-colonial movement, they would stop being isolated. They would have allies. They would have frameworks for resistance that didn't depend on white American goodwill. They would have an international context in which American racism wasn't just a domestic embarrassment, but a global crime that could be brought before international bodies. Malcolm tried to do exactly this, and in 1964 he came close. He met with African leaders. He spoke at the Organization of African Unity. He prepared documents to bring American racial violence before the United Nations. He was assassinated before he could complete this project. Whether the assassination was connected to this larger political work remains debated, but the timing was suggestive. Fidel Castro outlived Malcolm X by 51 years. He died in 2016 at age 90. In his later years, he occasionally mentioned their meeting, always with respect. In one speech, he said, Malcolm X understood that the struggle of black Americans was the same struggle as the struggle of colonized peoples everywhere. He saw what many refused to see, that racism and imperialism were the same system. Wearing different masks, whether Castro and Malcolm agreed on everything is irrelevant. They agreed on the essential thing, that the world's marginalized people shared a common enemy, and that identifying that enemy was the first step toward defeating it. The meeting at Hotel Teresa was brief, 30 minutes, in a borrowed room. in a Harlem hotel that white Manhattan didn't want them in. But it planted a seed that grew into a vision that still threatens the comfortable order of the world. And that's why, 64 years later, we still talk about it. Not because it changed history in some immediate, measurable way, but because it represented a possibility, a glimpse of what resistance could look like when it stopped asking for permission and started building its own alliances, in Harlem, on 125th Street, in a hotel that was supposed to be too black for Castro and too revolutionary for Malcolm, and turned out to be exactly right for both of them. In the years after the meeting, the Hotel Teresa's significance only grew. By the 1970s, it had been converted to offices, but the building remained a landmark. Today, a historical marker on the facade notes Castro's stay. Malcolm X's name doesn't appear on the marker, but anyone who knows the history knows he was there. That he walked in without an appointment and walked out part of something larger. That he saw in Castro's choice to come to Harlem a mirror of everything he'd been preaching about self-determination and dignity. That he sat across from the man America called its most dangerous foreign enemy and recognized him as a kindred spirit. Two men, different revolutions, same refusal. The refusal to accept that some people were born to make history and others were born to observe it from a distance. Malcolm X walked through that hotel door in September 1960 and proved that the people America tried hardest to silence were the ones most worth listening to. The FBI knew it, the State Department knew it, Hoover knew it. That's why they panicked, that's why they monitored, that's why 5 years later they watched and waited while someone else pulled the trigger. But they couldn't erase September 19, 1960, couldn't unring that bell, couldn't take back the image of Malcolm X and Fidel Castro sitting together in Harlem, talking about freedom as if America's permission wasn't required.